That was amazing. You just got quiet, like for no good reason. Well, welcome, and thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's cold out and whatever kind of weather is coming, but it's good that you've come. It says that you probably care about the church, and we care about the church, and we're going to talk about that tonight. We have had, we're lucky here at Myers Park, we have had many amazing guest speakers. And the best of the lot has come tonight.
He's a little biased.
So the Reverend Sarah Howell I have known for nearly 28 years in many circumstances. And she actually finished high school here at Myers Park High School, and went to Duke, and then went to Duke again. And now she is an associate pastor on the staff of Centenary United Methodist Church in Winston-Salem. She has a very cool midweek service that's called Roots Revival that I think is really exemplary for how to do a different kind of service from what traditional Sunday morning is like, and we may talk more about that as the evening goes along, but this is fun. Sarah and I did this program when did we do it? In October?
Sure.
For Union Seminary, and it was just so much fun, we thought we'd do it again. And you came to hear us, so that's great. So, Sarah, join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank y'all for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So we've come to talk about the church, and we kept having different titles for this. You know, there was kind of, the church's past and the church's future, and I guess that makes me the church's past, and Sarah's she is the church's future. The church's future is in the hands of people like her, and we have other young clergy that are in the room and some young lay people in the room, and the church will be in your hands. And I, for one, am excited about that. I have the privilege of teaching at Duke Divinity School, and there are some very sharp clergy who are coming on that I'm very excited to hand the church over to whenever my day comes to retire. One of the things, though, that we're going to talk about, though, is will it be the same church, right? When I started at the church, when I started as a pastor I guess I took off for seminary in 1976. I started working in churches, and I've been a pastor for a pretty good while now. There was still the idea that there was this institutional Methodist denomination that would be around forever, and there was a career ladder track, and you could rise up, and you could do well, and the pension fund would be secure, and everything would be great. And the world has changed in a lot of ways. And so in the United Methodist Church, there's a lot of panic about decline. The church has been in a long, slow decline for a long time. And sometimes we feel bad about that, but actually the Lutherans are in decline, and the Baptists are in decline, and everybody's in decline. Christendom is at some risk. In the United Methodist Church, we have, I don't know the numbers, I should have looked them up, the number of United Methodist churches that don't have any members under the age of 70. And this isn't 1 out of 100 churches. This is a lot of them. They will not exist in 20 more years. We have a little bit of an illusion here at Myers Park because we're doing really well, and it's rare that a Methodist church is doing this well. It's kind of an anomaly. But even I say, as well as we're doing what we're doing, I believe 50 years out, we're not still going to be doing what we're doing as well as it seems to be going right now. Do you know what I'm saying? We have to think about what the church is going to morph into and become. So Sarah and I just have some talking points. We're going to talk to each other for a little bit, and then we're going to invite you to ask us some questions, and Sarah will answer them as best she's able. And so thank you so much for being here. And one of the things that got us to think about this initially is that starting about 3 years ago, we were moving up to our denomination's general conference, and the bishops there are no bishops in the room, and none of you probably really know any bishops well, so I'm going to talk about these guys. And they're mostly guys, some women, but mostly guys. There's sort of this panic over the decline in the church, and so their reaction to this has been you got to work harder, you got to do better. You got to work harder, you got to do better. And they came up with this big denominational appeal called the Call to Action, and it was just all the ways we got to do better to save the church that is dwindling. Well, my daughter wrote a blog that was on the Call to Action, and it was really a wonderful, she actually sent it to me and said, this needs some editing, like how can I improve it? I said, publish it now. It was really good. And it was called The Call to Holiness. Talk about that.
Right, so I remember when the Call to Action came out, and it it is clear to me that the things that are happening in the church deserve attention and require some kind of a response. But I was just struck in this document that came out where it began by saying, this is not about preserving the institution. And then it proceeded to tell us how we need to preserve the institution, right? And that just didn't quite sit well with me. And I had just been reading a book that has been very influential to me in thinking about all of this, is one by Elaine Heath. It's called The Mystic Way of Evangelism. And she looks back to St. John of the Cross and his poem, The Dark Night of the Soul. And she says that the church, the mainline church, is in a dark night of the soul. We are in a time of searching and of seeking. But she points out that even for John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul was not a bad thing. It might have consisted of doubt and uncertainty, maybe some anxiety, but it was really an opportunity for St. John of the Cross to draw closer to God, to really look at his faith closely, to spend some time in quiet and in self-reflection. And so Elaine Heath says this is what the church has the opportunity to do now, to say, why do we do what we do? So much of what we do is to preserve our institution, to keep up these incredible buildings we have, but is that really what we're made for, what we're here for? So she says this dark night of the soul is a time to seek holiness, not to grab a lifeboat and figure out the best way to bail out water, but to really, really examine what we're doing and why we're here.
Yeah, I mean, the question I've gotten all this week, people have been wondering about our church, and the question I've gotten over and over this week is, did we make the budget? That's a reasonable question, of course. But if you think about it, the church does not exist so that we can meet the budget, right? The church must be for something else. And it may actually be that if we have trouble meeting budgets, a lot of churches are slashing budgets, a lot of church buildings are closing. We're moving toward a smaller church. And most people mourn this like, oh, it's so sad. Is a smaller church bad?
Yeah, at our charge conference in my missional network recently, our district superintendent actually kind of began by saying, most of our churches are going to close in the next 20 years. And this was kind of shocking to hear, but he was kind of talking on this same theme of this is a chance for us to really focus on what we're here for and what we're doing. I forgot where I was going with that, but...
It was good, though.
What did you say?
This is already different from the way we did it in October at school.
Last time he got off the script from the first sentence,
exactly.
So here we go.
What are we here for?
Oh, man. Well, so something that I remember hearing about a church, some big church with a big building and a big budget, and they had established this policy that they called, I think they called it something like ministries over mortar. And their goal was that they would always spend more money on actual ministries and missions than they would on the building itself. And I remember this came up in a meeting at our church, and people literally laughed because we have a big stone aging building. There's literally no way we could manage that, which makes me kind of sad because, it sounds a little cliche, but it seems like, Jesus didn't come and build buildings. Our buildings are beautiful, and I struggle with this a good bit because my favorite class in college was Gothic architecture. I love sacred architecture. I think our buildings are wonderful witnesses to the extravagant beauty of our God and of this world, and so a part of me wants to see them preserved as sacred spaces and as spaces for worship. But at the same time, it's hard for me to say that's what the church is for. Are we an architecture firm? Are we here to build stone buildings while we have folks hungry on the streets and people in need of community and relationship and love? And
so that's what the church is for,
yes.
Community and relationship. I mean, I used to quote this Frederick Buechner thing for years, and I loved quoting it. He once said, maybe the best thing that could happen to the church would be for all the buildings to come tumbling down, some tidal wave of history, just sweep it all away, the bulletins, the budgets. He said, then all we would have left would be Jesus and each other. And he said that's all there was in the first place. But I've always loved that quote. Well, I'm a steward of this building, right? I employ people. So there's something to the good, something good about the institution, and yet we lose our way. And one of the things we try to think about as the church moves forward is who are the people who won't come into our nice buildings and be part of our very fine institutions that we've worked so hard to hang on to? And Sarah knows and has been reaching a lot of these people. And who are the people they'll never come here?
Yeah, there are people that just will never come here, and that it's been a little bit of a tug of war at our church. We have a lot of folks who are rightly very proud of our beautiful building and want to use that more as sort of our face to the community, say, you come into our beautiful space. And it's hard for me to say, there are so many people who, for them, just the visual of a church is so intimidating. And that's something that we as the church have done, perhaps not individually, but as an institution, in many ways, we've hurt a lot of people over the years. And even if you have never been unkind to anyone ever, I somehow doubt that's true, but we all need to acknowledge that that is simply the reality for some people. And whether it's fair or not, it's still a true thing that we need to be able to understand and know that some people simply aren't going to see the beauty and the goodness that we see, and we have to be willing to be more of a bridge for some people.
And to be listeners. Mm-hmm. We have this whole section in here about kind of Christianity and the culture. And a lot of times Christians have been, fearful of the culture. The terrible things happening in the culture, we have to protect ourselves against that. We have to hide from the culture. Not realizing that in many ways we baptize parts of the culture that we're fond of. We don't realize how immersed in this culture that we really are. Sarah and I have talked a lot about culture, and I remember Sarah had this, I could talk about when she was a child. There was a dramatic moment in Sarah's life. She was listening to great musicians when she was young, like, Raffi, right? The music that little kids listen to. And then I made her this CD and said, here's some music you need to learn. And who was on that?
Joni Mitchell, Janis Ian, the Beatles,
yeah.
The Rolling Stones.
And there was I watched this conversion in her to a love of a new music. But it's not just about the music, it's the content of the music. So I want to segue and talk about worship for a minute. Sarah has a worship service that's really pretty remarkable. And the music they do is very different from what we do at Myers Park United Methodist Church. The main thing that's different about it is that they actually use secular songs. Now, I've been in this argument before we ask you about that. I've been in this thing for a long time that people talk a lot about what should our worship style be. And at Myers Park, we've kind of settled on sort of what we're doing. We have a service in here that's kind of contemporary music. I always like to joke about it. It's contemporary music, if you're in your mid-50s. It's Can I say that? Is that all right to say?
Yeah. You just did, so.
And then in the sanctuary, we do kind of traditional worship, and they're hymns. And sometimes people say to me things like, we want to hear the music in church that we always hear and enjoy in our lives. And I'm somebody who I've always argued against that because the music I like in my life is stuff, I like Led Zeppelin. We're not going to do that in church. And I like Chopin. That might eke its way into church, but probably not. Hymns are a peculiar genre of music that you don't listen to anywhere else. That's one of the things I've always thought was special about hymns is you don't really hear them anywhere else except in church. But there's been all this argument in my lifetime over the style of worship. And what I've always argued is it's the substance of worship that matters, not the style. You can have a really funky style that's appealing to people, but what I try to work on, and I know what Sarah tries to work on in a different way, is the substance of the service, which is more important than the style. So as Sarah has tackled the substance of her service in Winston-Salem, they use secular music. It's not Christian, it's not religious, it's not spiritual in any way. So I want you to tell these folks what that's about and how you came to that decision and what that's like for people.
Sure. So when we were first talking about starting this service, we were pretty clear that we didn't want to get stuck in what some people call the worship wars of traditional versus contemporary and organs versus guitars. And I like all of it, so I don't care. But we wanted something that could get past that and get to, like you said, the content of worship, what we're really there for. And we settled on, we do sort of have, stylistically, it's Americana music. We have acoustic musicians. And we wanted it to be liturgical. We do sing hymns, so there is this sort of traditional element to it. And the way we started incorporating secular music was kind of an accident. For our first worship service, it was an Advent service, and I happened to be telling our guitar player kind of, what I was thinking about talking about in my sermon, what the theme of the service would be. And he said, that reminds me of this Rolling Stones song, Shine a Light. Can we play that in worship? And my first reaction was, no, are you kidding me? We can't play the Rolling Stones in worship, as someone who grew up on his Rolling Stones. But, it was our first service. We were trying something new. I was a little bit afraid of this guitar player, so I decided just to let him try it and just see how it went. And it was incredible, the way it dovetailed with and expanded the sort of preaching moment. So when we use these songs, they're not congregational hymns. They're kind of a part of the sermon. They come before the scripture, and then after the sermon, we usually have two. And this has been a really interesting exercise for our leadership team and for the folks in worship, because what we found is that there is so much music that never makes it into church, but that has deep, deep connections to our spirits. Joan is someone that I love deeply. She gets my soul, and I have been able to incorporate her into worship. And even though it seems a little odd at first, once you do it, it makes all the sense in the world, because there are these things that touch us on a deeper level that resonate with our everyday lives. And so what we're doing is not trying to make the songs Christian or pretend that they were secretly written about Jesus, because then you fall into the Jesus is my boyfriend thing, and that's just weird. But we try and let them come into conversation with Scripture. We let them challenge us to talk about things that we wouldn't normally talk about in worship. I think probably the most out-of-left-field song we've used was a song by the 80s band XTC called Dear God, and it's an atheist manifesto. The song, the whole thing is asking God, why do you allow suffering? Why do you allow children to starve in the streets and people to fight? I simply cannot believe in you. And so...
It's not what we usually sing in church.
No, it was, and it had a very visceral effect on, you could feel it in the room, this discomfort, but it opened us up to this conversation about what does unbelief mean? How do we respond to non-believers, and how do we wrestle with our own doubt? So these things that well, they may not crop up in the lectionary per se, or even in a sermon series, but we find that the more we're able to sort of plumb these categories of music that we're already listening to, that people are going to hear on their iTunes later or in the car sometime, and they're going to hear it in a different way. They're going to remember something and think about something in a new way.
I hope you hear what's special in the way she's talking about this. A lot of churches use music to try to hook people and to draw them in. You know what I'm saying? It's like, ooh, if we do this pop song, they'll come, or whatever. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're saying that there's content in a lot of places, right? There's content. Lisa and I went in an art museum the other day. A lot of modern art, how should we say it, portrays life as pretty lonely and meaningless. And lo and behold, most people out there experience much of life as lonely and meaningless. And the church has always made the mistake of saying, you're not lonely. Oh, there's meaning. It's like, don't doubt, don't question. And the church of the future has got to engage people and say, it's good to ask questions. If you doubt, that's kind of the human condition. Who names the human condition? See, we've always said the Bible names the human condition, and so then what do you get? You're a sinner, and you better repent and do better, right? That's kind of the Bible's, and it's true. You're all of you, especially you guys back there. You're just sinners, and but actually the human condition is a lot of things. And so a few months ago, I thought of it. Lisa and I, my wife, were at a Sarah Bareilles concert, and we heard this one song where basically the woman says, I've become a stranger to myself. I'm not the person that I used to be. And this, you could have picked me up off the floor. Because I could look at myself in the mirror and say, I'm not the person I used to be. And lots of people have that experience. Do we say, bad, don't feel that way? Or do we say, this is the human condition? How do we, to allow, you've used this phrase before, the integrity of unbelief. Let me talk about that.
That's a phrase that I came across while I was doing an evangelism-directed study in seminary, and it was in the context of someone talking about postmodern evangelism, a big, weird phrase, but basically this understanding that we do live in a different world. This is not Christendom anymore. The church has for a long time occupied this very firm top dog place in American society, and that's starting to change. If anybody tells me Christians in America are persecuted, I'm not going to agree. But we're starting to not have quite the same sway in society that we once had, and that means we can't assume that everyone we talk to is Christian or even knows what we're talking about when we talk about the Bible or faith or belief. And that's something that we have to honor and respect. And if we believe in God as love, I think y'all just started a theme about you shall love. That love is non-coercive. I think about the movie Bruce Almighty. I think has oddly one of the best illustrations of how God's love works, and that Jim Carrey is bestowed with the powers of God, and when he tries to make his girlfriend love him, he finds he is unable to do so. And it's because love just doesn't work that way. And it's the same with faith, and that when we reach out to others, that they can choose to come along with us on this journey, and they may choose not to. And that is something that we get to respect. That there is integrity in unbelief.
And the love question. Sometimes I get weary with. One time I called it the long, boring, monotonous critique of the church. We live in a day where there's a spate of books and they're bestsellers that are trashing Christianity and the church and the Bible and Jesus and everything else. And then you just run into garden variety people out there, who, I used to go to church, I don't go anymore. And I'll say, oh, why? It's a bunch of hypocrites in the church. Yeah. Who else would there be? And so I've had to bear a lot of this in my life. And usually it's kind of gotten my back up and it's made me angry. But what I'm trying to think toward is like, how do I honor them, right? Because they've got a point. The church has made a fool of itself. The church has been an embarrassment to itself. And there are obvious things like, priests abusing children or clergy squirreling money away or having extramural affair. Whatever's going on, there's obvious kinds of things. But there are also just the smaller things where we've just been judgmental and narrow and closed-minded, and churches become little social clubs and nobody can really get in. And we do a little bit on the side for the poor, just a little bit, just for the heck of it. We're really interested in ourselves, and so we've earned that kind of critique. And actually, Jesus, most of the people he ran into weren't hymn-singing believers, right? They were very skeptical about him, and they actually ran him off and killed him, right? But he loved them, right? Including when he was on the cross, he loved them. So the question is, how do we love those who are outside the church? How do we love those who are inside the church? And the church of the future is going to have to wrestle with these things and figure it out. I think a lot about preaching. Poor Sarah grew up, she's heard kind of two preachers in her life. She heard me forever, and now she's hearing herself. And that's better than it is for my wife, who heard her dad and then me all of her life. And so I preach, and Sarah preaches, and she's a dynamite preacher. And I told somebody this the other day, and they said, I bet she preaches just like you. I took that as flattery, right? And I said, her preaching is nothing like mine. I think content-wise, we're very much together, but kind of sort of style-wise, it's very, very different. And how is preaching Your grandfather was a preacher, and we've listened to his sermons, right? And preaching is changing from what her grandfather did in the 50s and the 60s. And it's got to change because the world is changing and the church is changing. How do you see preaching changing?
One major thing that I've said in a couple different places is that I know for me, when I preach, I never assume everyone in the room is a Christian. I never assume that everyone in the room is 100% full on down with the Jesus thing. Because a lot of times there are people who aren't. Within our churches, without our churches, people who just aren't sure. And even within our churches, people who've been in church all their lives who know everything. We just live in a different world where there's just so much else going on. We can't assume that we're all on the same page. And I think this is something that I started to notice when I would be other places. I would hear people and I would realize they're preaching as if everybody is already on the same page, but we're not, and that's okay. And that's there's a lot of space in preaching today, I think, for just sort of getting back to basics and getting us all together and making sure we all really know what we're here for and what we're doing together, and something a little more kind of invitational and hospitable, so that someone who would come in might not immediately know that they're not a part of this club. It's easy for that to start to feel like insider talk. I drove here with another pastor, and we were talking about how much we speak in churchese and Christianese, and that there are all these words that we all know what they mean, or we think we all know what they mean, but maybe not all of us do, and that's okay. But how can even in our speaking, be hospitable and invitational and inclusive?
So my preaching students, I teach preaching at Duke, and one of the things I say is never use phrases like, now we all remember growing up in Sunday school, because there are a lot of people, they've never been to Sunday school in their life and don't remember it, and immediately you've said you're not one of the group. We never in preaching say, you remember Ezekiel's story of the dead bones. Well, a few of you in this room will, but others won't. And somebody asked me the other day, we had a Bible class the other night, and somebody said, why don't we bring Bibles to church and open our Bibles like during the service? I'd really love doing that in some ways, except you just have to know that would marginalize, I hate to say who's most important to me, that's not right. Whoever you are listening to me, you are most important to me. But I have a special heart for the people that they didn't think they'd ever be in a church again or ever, and they're here and they're not too sure about why they're here. And I don't want to humiliate them by saying, open your Bible. They don't have one. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 37. They've never heard of Ezekiel, right? So we want it to be as accessible as possible, especially for the people that have never been here before. As best we can tell in the New Testament, that's what Jesus and the disciples, that was their target group, right? And it should be the group for all of us in terms of hospitality in that. How is mission work? I mean, once upon a time, mission work was the way it happened in our denomination. Is you had a lot of big churches, and you had our conferences, and the conferences had a lot of money, and so the conferences built these big missional institutions. And we still, to this day, we have offices, the General Board of Global Ministries, right? And they have offices in New York. They would deploy missionaries around the world, and church budgets would cobble together some money and would be part of that. And we just had this grand flung enterprise all over the world. Well, the money's dried up for that, and the personnel is dried up for that, and the institution is dwindling. So that's not what mission looks like anymore. And it's changed in some other ways. Talk about the sort of changing face of missions.
Yeah, there's so much I could say about that. But
and you will.
So some of it is just on a baseline. What does the word missions mean? When I talk to my Baptist friends, sometimes when they say missions, they mean going and converting non-Christians. When I say missions, I'm more often talking about social justice activities. And then when most of my church members are talking about missions, they're probably talking about helping the poor and charity and giving to philanthropic organizations and that kind of thing. So, and it's fine for it to have all that definitions. We just sometimes need to know what the language is that we're speaking. One thing that my church has started doing recently that I think is a really great move is that we started to look at our missions budget, and it was because we hadn't met our budget and needed to cut some things, and but it ended up being a good moment for us because we looked at it and said, there are all these organizations that we give a little bit of money to that we really have no connection with besides this check that we send once a year. We don't even, maybe they send us a letter at Christmas, but we don't have any meaningful relationship with these groups. So how can we change our mission budgeting strategy to better reflect actual relationships and to make real impact? So we've tried to establish a general guideline that where our money goes, our people go. That we have people engaged in hands-on missions, in relational missions, wherever it is that we're sending financial support. And this has a lot of different benefits. It just makes it more meaningful, and I think closer to what being the hands and feet of Jesus. We weren't called to be the checkbook of Jesus. We're called to be the hands and feet. But it also just makes it a lot more meaningful for our people to know, they want to know that we're financially supporting important institutions in our community, but for them to actually know the people that we are working with, that we're ministering with, and the adverb with is really important rather than to or for. Learning what it means to come alongside people rather than simply offering them what we have out of the goodness of our hearts. And I remember in seminary reading a book by Justo Gonzalez where he talks about sometimes our impulse to do good can actually be destructive, because when we, from a position of power, help out someone in a lower position, we're maintaining an unjust status quo. And this gets gnarly and difficult because, we can't all, I don't know, well, I won't go there. But we need to, well, we can't all just become poor. Poverty is not romantic. Poverty kills. And we need to understand how kind of systemically this kind of thing works, and how sometimes the ways that we give as individuals, as a church, as an institution, can actually keep people in poverty. And that we participate in that through our best intentions. And that can be hard to swallow sometimes, but I think it's so important. And in our church, particularly with international missions, we've been taking a step back to kind of reevaluate, what does it mean that we'll spend thousands and thousands of dollars to send some of our people down to visit people in a slum of Port-au-Prince? What does that mean? What does that look like? And we did recently take a first trip back to Haiti after a long break from international missions, after taking a hard look at this and saying, we think there's a balance to be struck, and we think it's important for us to be present and bear witness and be in relationship with people where they are. But trying to move away from anything that might look like poverty tourism is a phrase that if you read Toxic Charity or When Helping Hurts or stuff like that you might hear. This sense that we go somewhere where there are poor people, and then we come back and feel so fortunate and blessed for all the good things that we have. And that's not helpful to anyone. Or we come back and feel really bad about ourselves. That's what I did when I came back from Haiti. But that wasn't really helping anyone. So trying to find a sort of a richer and deeper sense of what mission means and how it can be with and alongside and in relationship rather than giving down to someone is important.
And it's what we understand younger people in the world want and are interested in. So the old model of sort of the haves donating down to the have-nots, and trees where we collect toys for children for Christmas and kind of have it sent off somewhere, those days are over, and they should be over. On a different kind of day, a lot of people will engage in the missions and ministries of a congregation before they'll actually come to a service. One of the things I was going to talk about is the church getting out of the building. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. I'll begin by telling a funny story that happened here, and a few of you will have heard it before. But our young adults have this thing, I don't know if they're still doing it or not, but we're a while doing this thing called pub night. And like every Tuesday, they go to a different pub around town. And so one time they invited me to come. It was like, what would it be like if my dad came, So I went to pub night, and it was on the roof of this pub over there on Montford. And it was really cool. So I got there and people were there and there was kind of, buzz in the room. It was fun. And somebody came in a little bit late and she was like, and people said, what? She said, oh, I've had a terrible day. They listened to her. They hugged her. It was cool. Somebody else came in. She had her laptop and said, I just got back from a mission trip from Kenya. And she told all about it, what she'd done there. Somebody said, I want to go there. Oh, here's how you sign up. Okay. It's like church was happening right on the rooftop of this pub. So all these cool things were happening. I thought, this is church. It's right here. Now, I'm sort of famous at remembering names. So I know most people, but there are two people to my right. I just can't think of their names. And so I'm avoiding them, right? To avoid saying, ugh. And finally, I just couldn't avoid them any longer. So I finally turned and I said, I am so sorry. I don't know your name. And they said, well, we don't know your name. Their church is pub night, right? And I've told this story to some people, and they said, did you get them to come to church? I don't care if they come to church. You see what I'm saying? They're in church. Like, church is happening there already, right? So this taken, what does that mean? Taking church more out of the building and into the streets and where the people are, and we talk about that.
Yeah, so something that I've been thinking about lately is that there's this, we keep expecting people to care what's happening in these walls, but we don't seem to care what's happening outside of them. And if we want people to be interested in what we have going on here, then we need to pay attention to what's going on out there. I had kind of a strange moment last spring where at my church we were planning a big Pentecost festival, and we were all really excited about it. We were going to have a whole day of potluck and celebration and all this, and I realized it was at the same day, maybe a block and a half over, there was going to be a big music festival downtown. No one else was aware of this at all. I only knew because I hang out around downtown all the time. And it didn't seem to matter that we were going to do something at the same time. And that was fine. We had our Pentecost festival, and it was wonderful, and it was lovely. But I kept thinking, I hear so much about wanting to reach out to all the young people who are moving to downtown Winston, and yet they were right there. They were right there, and we weren't there. We were doing our own thing because we didn't care about what was going on 2 blocks over. And I guess this is kind of in reverse, that it still is in church walls. One thing we do as a component of our Wednesday service is a concert series. Just every now and then we'll bring in an artist who their music is not religious. This has been hard to explain to people. We don't bring in Christian artists, but that their content and style resonates with what we're doing. And a lot of it is an opportunity to invite people who would not show up for a worship service. And they come. We get people who say, who are nervous to be there and who say, I haven't been in a church in years. I swore I would never come back, but I really love this musician and I really want to see them. So, thank you for bringing them. We hear it from the artists. A lot of them have never played in a church, and so it's actually pretty funny. They don't quite know what our deal is or if we're going to try and convert them. And
then they hear Sarah preach a sermon based on their song.
Right.
It's really cool. It's really cool.
It's interesting to see their reactions. It's actually been really beautiful. We had a bluegrass band called the Ducks come, and their lead singer is a secular Canadian Jew, and he said, this is the first time I've felt welcome in a church. And we hear that again and again and again. And those people don't always come back, and I'm okay with that. That doesn't fly with my finance committee. Because they want, if this is an advertising opportunity, that means it's marketing, and then people are going to come in droves if we will just have these cool events. But something that I say at every concert is that we do this for 2 reasons. One is to let people know we're here, to invite people in. But the other is just because we think this is a good thing to do. It's a community service. It's a gesture of hospitality that doesn't have strings attached. You don't have to tell us that you're definitely going to come back. You can sign up for our email list, but you don't have to. We're not taking numbers of people committing their life to Jesus at the door. I've been to places that do that.
Membership.
So scary.
Membership.
That's a whole other thing.
Some of you know this and some don't. I've been on a campaign for the 12 years that I've been here to try to help us stop thinking so much about membership. Now, there's a great pride in being a member of the church, and I actually love it when I read obituaries and people at the hour of death think to put down, since 1952, he's been a member of Myers-Briggs United. That's a lovely thing. The fact is, younger adults, they don't care about membership. And I've just got to be honest with you, I don't care much about membership. I care about people. And if somebody comes here and they join or don't join, we have loads of members that never come and don't really care anything about us, but they're members, right? So the church of the future, though, very clearly will not be a church that's defined much by membership and pledging and all those sort of badges that we've always carried around, that's what it means to be part of a church. It's going to be more presence, activity out on the street. It's going to be that kind of thing as the church changes. Another thing that you mentioned earlier was this idea of mission as social justice. Say more about that. Because I believe the church of the future is going to be more a church of social justice than the church of the past has been, and I think it's a good thing. So talk about that.
Yeah, so it's always interesting to try and figure out how to talk about these things, because people, sometimes if you start talking about social justice, people immediately accuse you of dabbling in politics, and this is supposed to be really terrible. Jesus was political, folks. Jesus was not partisan. God doesn't care about our two-party system at all. I don't really either, frankly. It's a mess. But the public life was Jesus's arena, and it should be the church's too. And we should care about how things affect our neighbors, not just ourselves, because we're all bound together, right? And some of that, I don't remember what I was going to say. Some of that is bound up in things that are going to be uncomfortable, and policies that need changing. And we need to be able to talk about those things and to engage in those things without being afraid and without labeling one another and trying to accuse one another of getting too political, because really that's I don't think that's possible for a church.
Studies show that, especially younger adults who aren't in the church, and when they ask them, like, why don't you care about church? Like, the number one answer is something like, the church is just irrelevant to the real problems of the world. Right? They're not hearing anything out of the church that engages the real problems of the world. Now, a lot of you know I went on Saturday and saw the movie Selma, and I had the great grace to see it with a room full of largely African Americans, and I was sitting next to the woman who, when she was 15 years old, was the first black girl to go into a white school here in Charlotte, Dorothy Counts. So I saw the movie a little differently because of who I was with. What was amazing in that is the civil rights movement is a story of the church asking society to wake up and do the right thing. And that seemed very political, but now it just seems sensible to us, right? That you don't have separate entrances for blacks. You don't have separate water fountains for blacks. That blacks can't come in and eat at the lunch. That all seems normal to us now, but it was not once upon a time. So the church got active in being an advocate for people. Now that spills over into kind of the last question I want to ask, then have these guys ask us some questions. So the way the church thinks about ethical issues, for a long time, this was the easiest thing in the world, right? The church could just say, the Bible says these things, and in America, we've always thought these things, and this is incontrovertible, so the Bible says, and it just was clear. And there was just no debate on anything at all. And you may have noticed that here in the year 2015, there's a lot of debate about a lot of things that we once just took for granted. Now, what I'm thinking about, though, is for the church of the future. Clearly, some people think that what the church needs to do to live, in a lot of ways, is to go back to what we used to have. I hear this a lot of times. The church, in the 1953, the church had what? The church had a strong Sunday school. Somebody the other day said, we need big men's Bible classes. Because that was like, they used to have that in big, strong churches, right? I wonder if we could get that cranked up today. The big, strong men's Bible class. So the things that the church used to do, if we just go back and do what we used to do, all will be well. And there are probably some things that we need to go back and recover. But just to go back for the sake of nostalgia would probably be the death of us, because I did a consultation Sunday night and Monday with a church that's really struggling, and one of the things their kind of standard moniker of the church is, well, we've never done it that way. And there are loads of wonderful ideas that are being presented, and the answer is, well, we've never done it that way. And that church will be dead in about 10 years, right? Because that's just not... When Jesus came along, they said, oh, we've never done it your way, dude. And he was Jesus, right? So that's the principle. So how will the church of the future deal with ethical issues?
So one thing I was thinking about is that I've been trying to make this distinction between nostalgia and memory. The Bible tells us again and again to remember, and sometimes we remember by saying we should go back to the way it was in 1953. Well, in 1953, black people were being lynched, so maybe let's not do that. And so in memory, it's different. It's remembering the past, but acknowledging that we don't live there anymore, that God is drawing us into a future, that God has a vision that is bigger than ours. And we need to remember the core of what it is that Jesus came to show us and to do and to be for us, what we are called to do and to be as Christ's body. And that a lot of our rules that we've had over time, when they were in place, served a purpose, but sometimes we forget the purpose and we just grab onto some kind of a rule. And I have been drawn to this thinking about comparing how we deal with ethics to improvisational acting. And Sam Wells talks about it in a book, but I actually really like the way that Tina Fey talks about it in her memoir, Bossy Pants. She uses a lot less technical terminology. And Tina says that there are some basic rules of improv, that when you're doing a partner sketch in improv acting, the first rule is that you say yes. Whatever your partner does, you don't get to block it. You don't get to say no. And the example that she gives is that, if your partner points at you like this and says, bang, you're dead, you don't get to say, that's not a gun, that's just your finger, because then you've killed the whole scene and it's not funny and you're supposed to be funny, right? You say yes. And then the second rule is that you say yes and. And the church spends a lot of time saying no. We say no to more and more and more and more things as time goes on. But that there's actually freedom and space in what Sam Wells calls over-acceptance, that we can see something that we don't quite understand or that maybe doesn't fit with what we've always thought is how we do things, but we can say yes to that, we can accept, and then we can say and, we can contextualize it and come to understand it where we are. And so I think that the church of the future is going to need to stop blocking so much when it comes to ethics. We're going to need to learn to be more open and to stand for what is good and right and to stand against what is evil, but to just have a little looser grip on what we think those things are.
And to be open to the conversation. We get bad marks from outsiders because of our unwillingness to listen and to wrestle with issues that everybody else out there is wrestling with, and we just sort of batten down the hatches. And so how do we? Yes, that's a lovely way of thinking about that. Anything else you think of for these guys before we have them ask us some questions for you to answer? Good.
I think I'm good.
All right, so if you have a question, I'll try to hear it. I may not repeat it, but we'll at least in the answer say enough to imply what the topic of the question was. So, what would you want to ask us? Yes, Rick. Father of a young pastor.
I'll direct this to Sarah because I want to hear what the young perspective is.
All right.
What do you see as the future of denominations? I guess frame your answer along the lines of what appears to be a trend with the big mega churches disassociating themselves from denominations pretty much entirely. It seems like you've got, in Charlotte we have a big church called Elevation Church, which I think is nominally Baptist but doesn't hold itself out as being Baptist. But where do you see denominations relevant anymore? Are they going to die over the next 20 years? What do you think?
This is something that my peers and I talk about a good bit. If you look at a Methodist church right now, most of your people are not going to know what it means that they're Methodist. A lot of them are there because their marriage is between a Baptist and a Catholic, and this was a good middle road. That happens a lot, just saying. And so we already have kind of lost a sense of identity as a denomination. And in some ways, I lament that because I really love Wesleyan theology. I think we have a very rich heritage that I want to see continue. And so, but denominations are becoming less and less relevant to actual people. And once upon a time, when people moved to a new city, they would find the Methodist church in their town and go there. And that doesn't really, sometimes maybe, but most of the time that doesn't happen anymore. And we are going to eventually, I think, have to find a way to let go of some of these structures. And what that means for preserving like a theological heritage, I don't know, because that to me is important. Some of my friends and I have asked the questions about, what happens to denominational seminaries. I went to Duke, and it's, there's more Methodist than anybody else, but there's tons of other denominations and traditions, and I felt like my education was enriched by being in contact with them. So I think the future of denominations, I'm not sure what it'll look like, but it's going to need to change pretty radically, and I think there needs to be kind of a sense of approaching it with seeing it as an opportunity, but also trying to, carry the things that are good, that remain important and core to who we are. But I'll be really interested to see how that looks. I do know that I think that the church is going to change more in my lifetime than it has in a very long time. And sometimes that's scary, sometimes that's exciting. So, I don't know.
I mean, Rick, you didn't ask for me, but a mistake that we've made for a long time is we've confused sort of what is the wonder of our denomination, which is, I think, our theology, our worship, our understanding of mission. We've confused that with the institutional trappings and with the bureaucracies, right? And so now we're trying to prop up the bureaucracies and keep the institutions and the pension funds and all that alive, which is a huge mistake, because that's spending all the energy on what is only the external shell of what actually matters. I tend to think that we'll pay for that. I mean, we have way fewer district superintendents than we used to have. We have fewer bishops than we used to have. We have fewer denominational bureaucrats than we used to have. There's no reason to think that's going to stabilize or turn around. So it's going to continue to get smaller and smaller. Many of us at least think that's just not a bad thing. It's a lot of bureaucracy and it's a lot of institution. And I just don't get up in the morning thinking, I'm going to work for Methodism today. That just doesn't motivate me. And I'll be honest with you, I don't even get up in the morning thinking, I want to make some Methodists today. I just don't. I want to make some Christians today. Like I want us to follow Jesus today. Yes. Oh, yeah. Chris.
So as younger adults are seeing themselves in a community that's not necessarily just a local community, we see ourselves as citizens of the world, and we're seeing what the church is doing in undeveloped or developing countries where we're moving along, and we feel that we're in a different place than we've ever been, and we look at that church, and it looks like the old church, and it looks like the place where there's a lot of conservative thoughts. What is the church of the Western world and developed nations? How do they separate from that or say, look, it's not just what you're doing in Charlotte, the church is that as well, and it's not as good as what you're doing here. And how do we separate ourselves from that?
The church is growing way faster in the Southern Hemisphere. And in a lot of ways, that's incredible and wonderful and beautiful. And it is challenging. In the Methodist Church, we've experienced great challenges with how we deal with social issues when we're yoked with our brothers and sisters in the Congo and in places where the culture is completely different. And there needs to be some respect for those differences and some sort of division. And I don't know quite what it looks like to remain part of that body, because I do believe that we need all of those pieces. the progressive church needs the fundamentalist church to keep us from totally, or whoever, I don't know who the progressive church is, from totally flying off the banister. We need that as kind of a ballast. Somebody else made that metaphor, I don't remember who, but it wasn't me. And so there needs to be some maintenance of that bond. But I don't know.
Chris, I tend to think that institutionally, the church will become smaller and more fragmented and more neighborly, if you will, because an institution is fragile anyway. And so to try to maintain it with the Sudan, India, Sri Lanka is going to become increasingly difficult. So I think institutionally we'll get smaller and we'll become more local. Philosophically, I think we'll be more international. We already have this actually, right? Because of Facebook, texting, all of the technologies, I'm able in an instant to be in close contact with somebody in another country, somebody in another state. And so we already, as a church, I don't know if you know this, we have people who call Myers Park Methodist Church their home church, and they live in Wisconsin, they live in California. We have a couple that live in China. They catch us by live streaming, and we're their church. I mean, the story I love to tell is a couple years ago, somebody called the house at night, and I was out, and my son Noah answered the phone, and there was a man on the other end, and he'd been watching our live streaming, reading my emails, and just following our church's website, and he was at a point of wanting to kill himself. And he wanted to speak to me, and I was not home. And somehow Noah talked him off the ledge. And then I got to call him back later, and it was interesting, though. Like, I was his pastor, and he was in Wisconsin. We're going to see more of that in the future. People are going to be less tied to locality. There's a great wonder in that. That's wonderful. And then at the end of the day, though, boy, we just need. I mean, I know people. They've said, "Oh, since you do live streaming, I quit coming to church." I'm like, oh. And because it's not a show, it's not entertainment. And one of the things that we get here is like you got to touch another person. You got to deal with somebody that's crabby out in the parking lot. You got to fight for a seat. Whatever it is you have to do here, right? And that's good for us. That helps us to grow, that kind of physical contact. So there are going to be some gains and some losses in that as we move forward. That's a great question. Yes?
I have a different view of something you said, and then I'd like to ask you a question. You said the church was in the leadership of the civil rights movement. That's not entirely true. The black church was in the leadership.
Correct.
The white church, basically, especially in the South, sat on its hands or even worse than that.
They fan the flames of
Yeah.
prejudice,
And
yes.
so all of the momentous events that have happened to our country since 9/11, I think organized churchery has been largely irrelevant. So in 50 years, we don't seem to have learned anything. And I don't have great confidence that in the next 50 years, things may change. I'd like for you to convince me otherwise. But the question I have is to ask you to suspend every experience you've had and everything you know, and except for a moment that Christ was here in your lifetime, and he was crucified and dead and buried and rose 18 months ago, and now someone has come up to you and said, we need to get organized. What would you do, and what would the organization look like? Would it have a big building? What would it look like?
Could you repeat the question?
Your turn. I went first last time.
There, one of the common criticisms we hear today, people just love to say, "Oh, I hate organized religion," and my cute rejoinder is, well, the only thing worse than unorganized religion, the other thing worse than organized religion is disorganized religion. It's not a great line, but I like it. We got to be organized in some way, and so it's understandable that we got organized over time and that we built buildings. And I don't know, how do you make it foolproof that, let's say we started from scratch again and Jesus was ready, we get to do it over, like we get a mulligan, and we get to start Christianity over. Would we do it any better? And we probably wouldn't do it any better because it's fallen, broken people who are in the church. And so we would probably repeat old errors, or maybe we'd have the wisdom not to repeat those. I always told Sarah, like in parenting, there were some mistakes my parents made, and I'm like, I ain't making those mistakes. So I've made a whole new set on my children, right? So we'd make a whole new set of mistakes. We might not make the same old ones, but we'd make some mistakes. So that's why I always want to be patient with the flawedness of the church. I think Jesus fully understood and knew that we'd get it wrong because all the people around him got it wrong, right? Peter's saying, I don't know that man. I don't know. You know, these are the people that were closest to him. Like, they didn't get it at all. So we would get it wrong. And so it just falls to every generation to try really hard to get it as right as we can, knowing that we've got blind spots, right? So Sarah and I can say, here are some things the church really needs to do. We've got our own blind spots. And 50 years later, somebody could look back at the things that we're saying and go, that was so stupid. And we're like, oh, we didn't know. That's just inevitable. What I dream for in the church, though, is the openness to say, here's where we're flawed, here's where we're broken, and to be willing to try to be healed from that. One of the hardest things that pastors have to do for a living, I'm not saying James at Myers Park or Sarah at Centenary, but just pastors in general have to do for a living, is we try to work with folks who feel like there's nothing wrong with us. Our church is great as it is. The way we've always done it is a wonderful thing. We shouldn't really change anything. That's not the way we have always, you know what I'm saying? And so to have an openness to the kind of hard surgery. You know, it's a hard thing when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you've got something in you and it's a malignancy. And we could save your life, but you've got to undergo this really difficult, that's hard to hear. You'd rather just go home and pretend that diagnosis was not made. So things like what Sarah was talking about is being able to talk about the relevant issues of the, I'm talking too long, but I've got to get this in while we're on it. To talk about the relevant issues of the day. One of the things, I'll just tell you this, one of the things that all clergy will tell you is that sometimes people say, why don't you say more about the hard issues of the day? And one of the reasons is there is a demotivation, I'm just being honest with you, and it's the church people. I had a member of this church, a wonderful person that I love dearly, come to me recently and said, you're a good speaker, but you talk about the wrong things. And I said, tell me more about that. And what she was on is I had in several sermons talked about that we have an obligation to do something for the poor. She said, that's political. You're not supposed to talk about political things. Well, it becomes a political thing, right? Because part of politics is thinking about what do we do about the problems of our society, and different politicians have different viewpoints about that and so on. But as Christians, we have there's an absolute obligation that we'll never be able to get rid of unless we get rid of Jesus, to say we have an obligation to the poor. That's just in our charter. But for many clergy, there's a lot of pushback when we try to talk about the issues of the day, and so that's a demotivator for many. So what I dream of for the broader church is a church that is eager, ready to be told some surgery is required. It's hard. But we all need it in our own souls, and if we all need it in our own souls, we all need it in our congregations and in our groups and in our classes and kind of everywhere, right? But that's a hard word to hear. Anyhow.
Sorry, just real quick.
Yeah.
Something I resonate with that I see more of, and it's not new, obviously, but there's increasingly desire to go back to kind of how the early church did things. And one of the ways that I got to experience this my last year of seminary was I was a part of a house church in Durham, and I grew up in churches like this, giant churches. And so it was a very different experience for me, and our little slogan for our house church was, don't like organized religion? Well, we're not very organized. But there was a richness and depth and difficulty to that community that I had not experienced before, because there were only maybe 15 of us, and we all had to work together all the time. And it was really wonderful and beautiful and life-giving. And I have friends that are living in new monastic communities, returning to these very close-knit communal relational settings for exploring faith and for doing justice in the world. And so it's so interesting to me that, as we become kind of globalized through technology, at the same time, there's this urge to come back together face-to-face in these small group settings, which is a pretty Wesleyan thing to do as well. So.
Yes.
My daughter and her family, five, live in St. Paul, Minnesota, and they belong to the home church that you're talking about. And they have about 30 people that come over every Monday night for an eat dinner, and they have a communion and a little service, and they have wonderfully trained people, lay people that are just training themselves, and there's a very loose affiliation of 12 of these churches, and they have on Sunday, just go to a community center, and they have one minister, and he accepts whatever people put in the fold, but there's no building, there's no clergy, and there are no employees, except for this one man gets he's a really wonderful preacher that just comes and preaches on Sunday mornings for an hour.
So let me ask you, as they can't hear you, do you have a question in this?
Well, the thing is, I was just reinforcing what she was talking about, this home church idea as a way to spread the word without having to have the clergy and the building.
Well,
and the things that you're talking about, and they can apply.
He's sharing about a family member in Minnesota who's part of a home church and how cool that is. So, yeah.
Well, and something that hasn't come up yet, but that I think is an important part of the future of the church that I first read about in the Elaine Heath book I mentioned earlier, and the first time I read it, I said, forget this, but she talks about bivocational ministry, and this idea that we're not going to be able to keep all of our every full-time clergy person that we have right now, we're probably not going to be able to support all of us in I don't know how many years.
Not many.
But this idea of bivocational ministry, of being employed outside of the church while serving in a ministry position, I hated that idea the first time I heard it. And the more I think about it, the more I think, no, that's going to be really important. And not just for the practical financial reasons, but because it feeds into this sense of the church being more engaged in the community and in the world around us. That the house church that I was a part of, our pastor was a bartender. Funny, but it ended up being very enriching for the life of the church because he just met people that you wouldn't meet in a church like this, and those people, some of them became a part of our life as a community. And it was because he was in these spaces where so often the church just doesn't have any kind of presence, and he wasn't there converting people. He was just being a person in public. I think that's something that our clergy are going to have to do more of, is just to be people in public and know people in our community a little more.
To think about a trend, though, toward more house churches in the future, I would just issue kind of my little warning about the downside to that. I have a longtime friend who used to belong to a big church, and he didn't like it anymore. He joined a smaller church that he liked more. He didn't like it anymore after a while. He's gotten smaller and smaller. Now he's in a little house church, and who has he joined up in the house church with? A bunch of people who just mirror his kind of narrow thinking back to himself. So there's no challenge there. There's no having to deal with difficult people there. There's no having to deal with different people there. One of the virtues that denominations have had, and one of the reasons that theological education matters, and we think a lot about the closing of the seminaries as denominations run out of money, and it's a concern, when I decided I might go in the ministry, I was a good-hearted person, and I was kind of, my sum total of knowledge was like, God loves us, and I love God. That was like all I knew, right? And so if you'd asked me then, what's the prophetic challenge to the church in our day? I had no idea. I had no way to think about that. So you go to seminary, and one of the things they're schooled in is that the church has had these traditions of thought and theology and right ways to think of God versus less helpful ways to think about God, and you learn all of that, and then the goal is to share that with the congregation, to give them some accountability and some wisdom. So all kinds of things. If you'd asked me the day I went to seminary, I don't know what I would have said. Let's say you'd said, why do bad things happen to people? Right? I might have said, well, God does all these things. I don't know what I would have said. Well, I've learned a lot since then, and I'm able to think about that and help us think about it. And as we get narrow, and if we lost seminary education just at house churches, we'd lose some of that. And you'd also lose, I love the wonder of being part of a denomination in that I have colleagues all over the country and world. And that those friendships matter, but also it enables us to get some amazing things done in other places. So, I found myself a couple years ago preaching in Liberia. And we, started a little internet cafe there, and there's a lot of cool things that can happen. People ding the large churches nowadays, but the large church can do some pretty cool things, right? Like at Haiti, we built a clinic and a granary. It's not that size is everything, but you can join together with other people and do stuff that my friend in his house church can never get done. And there's a beauty in that I think we don't want to lose if we can hang on to it somehow. Anyway,
and
Jim.
Something I think is true is that there is a sense in which the institutions overall are going to change, they're going to have to change, but they're not going to completely go away. And I think of it more as kind of a broadening and an opening up to include more ways of doing things. So, your Myers Parks might still be, I don't know, maybe you'll still be around in 50 years. That'd be great. Y'all are awesome. But there may be more other different kinds of manifestations of what church is that are also a part of that.
I would hope denominations matter less and less, because I've not cared about them that much in my lifetime. And I think it's absurd that we have this, this competition. Like I just hate this, right? I'll just be honest, I run into Presbyterians from next door, right? And they're trying to be pleasant people. God bless them. And they'll say things like,
They can't help it, they're Calvinists.
They're here, they can't help it. and they'll say things like, we're part of the competition. And we're just joking around. I totally get it. But we've really thought of it that way. Like, we're competing with the Presbyterians. Who's the biggest in Charlotte? The competition is like the cynical, atheistic world that's who the competition is. So my dream would be, as the church moves forward, denominations would not matter as much, or you could have why couldn't somebody figure out that, let's say Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Methodists would just be like one thing. Why do we have multiple seminaries? If you teach, Lloyd Witherspoon is here, great professor of Bible. Lloyd could teach Bible in a Lutheran seminary or in a Presbyterian seminary. The facts of the Bible are the facts of the Bible. The history of Israel is the history of Israel. And so why do we duplicate these things over and over? We're not going to be able to sustain that over time, so can we figure out how to cooperate and work together on those things? My dream is that we'll figure that out before we all just fall apart. Now, Jim.
Sarah, you had said that the younger generation does not want to join the church as it is today because it does not meet their needs. What are the needs that they have that are not being met?
Why'd you say that?
So an inherent flaw in this whole thing is that I don't speak for my whole generation. Ooh. And so the question was about the younger generation feeling that needs are unmet. So some of it is about welcome and hospitality. So there's a young woman that comes to our Wednesday service, and the way she started coming was I was in a bar watching a basketball game and happened to start talking to her, and after she found out what I did, I ended up inviting her to church, and the first thing she wanted to know about my church is, do you welcome gays and lesbians? That was her first question. And that's a question at the forefront of a lot of young people's minds, and it will keep a lot of young people away. They're not interested in a place that won't welcome their friends and their family members. So sometimes the needs, some of it's about us, and some of it's about the world, and about how we do or don't engage in justice issues and in civil rights issues. Something I will say is that I think a lot of times people make the mistake of thinking that what young people want is something really entertaining. If the church is trying to get into the entertainment business, we are going to fail. There are loads more entertaining things out there in the world, and sleeping in and going to Sunday brunch is going to be more entertaining than church is going to be entertaining. But if we're about feeding souls, if we're about connecting people relationally, relationship is really important to most young people, I guess. And about taking seriously the things that we're talking about and thinking about in our everyday lives.
But if they don't take the initiative to go find out, to me it's a kind of joint venture between the church and the younger generation, that we don't know, we may not know where to go find all of this flock of people, but they've got to make an effort and create an initiative to come to this platform to engage in some way that they can, if it's meaningful.
They haven't got to.
So some question is, why would they? Why would they? So he's talking about younger people taking the initiative to come see and to come find out as a joint venture. And there is some element of a joint venture, but why would we? Something that I ask, I get older folks in my church a lot come up to me and almost accusingly ask, where are all of the young people? And I say, I don't know. But a question that I ask a lot is, do you know young people in your own life? In your world, in your daily life, do you know any young people? If not, why would you expect them to come to your church? But if you're befriending, and we can't individually go bring 100 young people to church, but what I see is just a couple Sundays ago, there was an older woman in my church, and she had come into contact through a community arts event with a college student and had invited her to church and brought her along. That is how young people will come, is if they come along with someone that they know and respect and trust.
But part of my point is, if they don't make the initiative, how can they claim that the church is not meeting their needs?
Right. Well, and my point is that they don't feel that they need the church to meet their needs, and they don't have a good reason to come find out otherwise.
And it's important to remember that it's not like it's only young people that are cynical about the church. I know loads of people my age, your age, all ages. People my father's age, he's 90. I know people my father's age. It's not like everybody who's 90 is churched, right? Loads of those people haven't been in church in years, and they view the church as just kind of a waste of time and just doesn't have anything to say and doesn't matter to me. Or there's the common experience for people who've been to church is that they were hurt by the church. We forget this all the time, the number of people that have just been so wounded by churches. And sometimes it's by very kind people who they just make an unwitting remark, or whatever. The churches have hurt a lot of people. I love what you said about the woman in the bar's question about gays and lesbians. However, we've talked about this issue a lot here in different ways. It's important to realize that is a driving question for so many people who are outside the church, and it's like one of the biggest things that keeps people from starting that initiative to come into the church. They just don't want to be part of a place that is condemning of their sister, their father, their co-workers, their roommates, people that they know and love and know are not perverse or, that's just a huge thing that the church has gotten wrong for a good while, clearly. And it's alienated, just that one thing alone has alienated, isn't that right? Has alienated huge swaths of people.
Because if we're willing to condemn certain people, why wouldn't we condemn everyone who's different?
We have a young hand here. Nicole.
How do you move beyond the introversion and the rejoicing in our brokenness of a lot of the emerging styles of worship? How do you move from that into something that is more meaningful, where you are doing that surgery, because there's a lot of beauty in belonging to a church and investing in a church rather than this consumerist, I'm going to go play in the band at this church for this worship service, and then I'm going to go to Sunday school at this church, and then I'm going to go get my podcast at this church. How do you bring people back to the local church? Because I think a lot of young people want that as well. And they get tired of hearing, oh yeah, we're all broken. Yep, we're all broken. So, how do you move beyond that?
Can you repeat that question?
So she's asking about, I don't know if I can repeat it. That
was well said.
So resisting this sort of consumerist approach to church, where we're going to Sunday school one place, worship one place, podcast another, and this sort of focus on, okay, yeah, we're all broken, we get it. I don't know. You want to say?
We have, I often say we have a lot of young adults in our church. I wish we had more, but we have a good number of young adults in our church, especially when you compare it to other Methodist churches, right? Especially other large Methodist churches where there are 0 young adults in the church. None. We have a lot. And so we like to think that we can connect, but then provide the context in which that deeper journey can happen. Now, one of the things you always have to take into account in this is just garden variety human sinfulness, right? We tend to think people aren't seeking God and it's the church's fault. But actually, there's something in the human soul that is in rebellion against God, right? And so there's garden variety resistance to God that's always been there through all of human history, and it affects all age groups and all cultures, right? Just don't want any part of God asking me to change my life because I want to hang on to my life as it is. So that's always a huge factor in that. So it's not like the church has failed always, even though we have.
And I think a lot of times the church is quick to offer punishment and not so quick to offer healing. And to Elaine Heath again, she contextualizes sin as wounds, and so then the remedy is healing and reconciliation. And I think that kind of approach in community, because that relational component is really important, I think can take us deeper.
I'm going to call it for one more question because we're almost at 8:30. Tom.
I've learned that problems are solved between groups by using empathy. And empathy is developed by relationships between groups. In Myers Park, we're not poor, we're not black, we're not Hispanic. How do we solve these problems, these group problems? What can we do individually as a church to help solve some of these problems that we read about every morning, every day?
So the question is, how do we, so you talk about solving problems by empathy between groups and acknowledging that most of us are not black and, right, and just, so how do we engage in difference in relationship to solve problems? So we mentioned something about listening earlier. I think that's really important. I think that technology has in many ways allowed us to be exposed to lots of different ways of thinking, but it's also made it easy to make your life an echo chamber. I remember reading an article one time saying that what technology allows us to do is to pick and choose who we're interacting with at a given time. Even just the concept of voicemail does this. We get to decide, we get to filter our experiences and our interactions. And so we tend toward people who share our interests, who look like us, who enjoy the same things we do, and who think the same way we do politically. And so it's been interesting for me over the past several months, particularly with everything around Michael Brown and Eric Garner and all of this, to watch my Facebook feed, because there's a little more diversity in it than I might have expected, but you can tell that most people are only talking to people who think one way about this, and most people are only talking to another group of people who think the same way they do. And that's a lot of what the church needs to be able to do, is to engage those conversations of difference, to not perpetuate that echo chamber of thought.
Yeah, it's a Christian principle, and if I've been your pastor for a while, you've heard me nag about this periodically. I don't do it every day because it gets old. That one of the mistakes that we make, and I think it's gotten more common since 9/11, because we've gotten more fearful and we seek more security, and we're more fearful of those who are different than we once were, amazingly, that increasingly we want to be around people who are like us, they look like us, they're our age. So we have young parents who come to the church. They don't ask, do you have interesting older people in your church? They don't ask that. They're like, do you have other young parents in your church, right? So we want to be around people who are like us, and that's natural and it's understandable. The drawback to that is, of course, is you just feed on your own narrow biases and you aren't stretched. I can tell you this, I would have loved seeing the movie Selma anytime, anywhere, with anybody. I kind of had this dream of going with my family. We'd enjoy seeing that together. I thank God I got to see it Saturday with a largely African American audience. And there were people in that room who they knew exactly what mid-60s Alabama felt like and could talk about it. And it was in their emotional reaction. That was a great gift to me to do that with other people. So we have things like South Tryon Community Church, and we talk about this, and a few of you have been over there a few times. To me, the coolest thing that's come out of the South Tryon relationship is there are some actual friendships that have happened. There are South Tryon people who are friends with Myers Park people, and you can catch them out at lunch together. You can catch them, right, going to a ball game together. It's not a charity case. You've actually made friendships. And so just to listen to people, I mean, the racial tension in our country, I was on this panel discussion after the Selma thing. And one of the things that I said is that with most white people that I know, if you bring up the subject of race, the people are like, been there, done that, like, right? We did that a while back, it's over. And it's not over. And if you don't believe it's over, just watch Ferguson, watch any of the things that are going on in the news, and just the puzzlement that both sides have looking at each other. So how do we just listen to each other? I remember this was amazing, after the O.J. Simpson verdict came down, right? There was this shocking division in America. Like, whites across America were like, oh, it's the world, I can't believe. People were just appalled. And in the African American community, there was a lot of like, yes. And everybody was so distressed over this division. So I just thought, I got to figure out what that's about. So we lived in Davidson at the time, and I knew people on the other side of the track, and I just sat down with a bunch of people and said, tell me how you feel about this OJ thing. I just learned so much that I did not know about feelings and everything else. And the same thing can be going on now. But again, you got to take the time. Like, if you belong to a club, if you're in a book club, if you're in a bridge group, and whatever you're in, you're probably in it with people that are like you. There's nothing bad about that. But for us to grow and for society to change, you got to book in some time and the effort to know people that are different and listen to them and be willing to share with them. Society won't change until that happens. It just won't. And you won't grow until you do this, I don't think. And you want to grow. We all want to grow. Anyway, that was a sermon I didn't mean to preach, but it came up. I'm going to call time because we're past 8:30. This has, for us, been a tremendous, like father-daughter outing, right? This is great fun. And you've made it special by being here and being attentive and listening and your questions and responses. And so thank you so very much for coming.
Thank you.